People think power comes from relationships, but sometimes the strongest version of you appears when you stand alone. I didn't choose singleness as a backup plan. I chose it as a path to clarity, confidence, and unstoppable growth. When the noise of expectations finally faded, I began hearing my own voice louder, sharper, and more determined than ever before. Every goal I postponed, every dream I shrank to make room for others, suddenly had space to breathe again. This is Single by Choice, Powerful by Nature, the story of how embracing independence didn't isolate me. It awakened me. It taught me to trust myself, rebuild myself, and create a life that doesn't wait for permission. Chapter 1. The moment independence became my path. I didn't wake up one day with certainty. Instead, clarity grew slowly as I began noticing how much of my life had been shaped around what others expected from me. I used to stretch myself thin, trying to maintain connections that never fed me, hoping they would eventually offer the fulfillment I imagined. Over time, I realized that waiting for someone else to complete my story only kept me stuck in a loop of disappointment. The more I listened to my own thoughts, the more I understood how far I had drifted from who I really was. I felt a pull towards something new, something honest, something mine. That pull would soon become the turning point. I started paying attention to the subtle signals, those little instincts that whispered whenever I pretended to be happy around people who didn't value my presence. Each time I ignored those feelings, a small part of my identity dimmed, as if I were shrinking myself to fit into spaces not meant for me. Eventually, the weight of pretending became heavier than the fear of being alone. I knew something had to shift before I lost the parts of me that still hoped for more. Independence didn't call to me loudly at first, but it did consistently. And consistency has a way of uncovering truths you can't avoid forever. The conversations I used to chase began to feel empty, like echoes in a room without meaning. I noticed how often I gave comfort to others while neglecting my own emotional needs, constantly offering energy that returned to me in fragments. It became clear that the connections I held onto were built more on habit than genuine care. Realizing this was painful, yet strangely liberating. I could feel myself stepping closer to a version of life where my voice mattered. The shift wasn't about rejecting people, it was about reclaiming myself. I had spent so much time seeking approval that I barely remembered what it felt like to choose something purely because it felt right to me. The idea of independence began to form not as an escape, but as a foundation. It wasn't loneliness I feared. It was the possibility of staying trapped in a life that didn't reflect my truth. The distance I began to create wasn't meant to push away the world, but to create space to breathe again. That space slowly became my sanctuary. And in that sanctuary, I began rebuilding. Stepping into independence felt like opening a door I once believed was locked. I had always associated strength with perseverance, even in situations that drained my spirit. But strength, I learned, could also look like walking away from anything that dimmed my inner fire. I started observing my life, as if from the outside, noticing how much brighter I became when I honored my own needs. It wasn't a sudden transformation, it was a gradual awakening. And the more aware I became, the more the path ahead made sense. The loneliness I feared transformed into solitude, and solitude became something sacred. I discovered the quiet joy of hearing my thoughts without interruption, without judgment, without compromise. In that quiet, I found pieces of myself I had abandoned for the comfort of companionship. The more I listened to myself, the clearer my desires became, revealing dreams I had buried for far too long. I realized I didn't need to wait for support to pursue them. I had everything I needed within me. Independence stopped being an option and became a necessity. Each day, my confidence stretched a little further, reaching into areas of my life I once doubted I could control. Tasks that seemed overwhelming now felt manageable because they were fueled by purpose instead of pressure. I began trusting my decisions without seeking validation, making choices based solely on what aligned with my growth. This newfound trust felt like an anchor in a world that had previously felt unpredictable. It grounded me in ways I never expected. And in that grounding, I found freedom. I started moving through life with a different kind of presence, calmer, sharper, more aware of the energy I allowed around me. No longer did I rush to fill silence with conversation or force connections to survive. I began understanding that anything genuine never needed forcing. This understanding strengthened my boundaries, giving me the courage to choose peace over chaos. For the first time, I wasn't afraid to stand alone. It felt like stepping into light after years of shadows. It felt like becoming whole. The more I embraced independence, the more I recognized the ways I had underestimated myself. I had always believed partnership was the key to stability, yet I found a deeper stability emerging from self-reliance. My days became filled with choices that reflected who I was becoming, not who I had been trying to be. I noticed how naturally my life aligned when I removed pressure to impress or conform. Everything became clearer when I stopped competing with expectations. In clarity, I discovered ease. I learned to appreciate small victories, cooking for myself, organizing my space, creating routines that centered my well-being. These simple acts carried meaning because they represented control over my own narrative. I wasn't adjusting my life for someone else's convenience anymore. Every step I took was guided by my own intuition. And in trusting that intuition, I rediscovered a sense of stability that external relationships had never provided. It wasn't independence for the sake of rebellion. It was independence for the sake of resurrecting who I truly was. Relationships I once clung to began to fade naturally, not out of conflict, but evolution. I stopped trying to revive connections that no longer aligned with where I was headed. Instead, I directed my energy toward growth, healing, and understanding my own capacity. The more I released, the more space I gained for transformation. And in that space, I unearthed resilience. My path wasn't shaped by rejection, but by revelation. Revelation of what I deserved and what I had settled for. I began redefining what love meant to me. Love became less about attachment and more about respect. Respect for my time, my boundaries, and my emotional capacity. I recognized how often I had sacrificed parts of myself to keep others close, believing that giving endlessly guaranteed loyalty. Independence shattered that belief and taught me that real love begins internally. It begins with honoring your worth, even when no one else acknowledges it. That shift changed everything. What surprised me most was how natural independence felt once I stopped resisting it. It didn't feel cold or isolating. It felt expansive. It opened doors to passions I had long ignored, inviting me to explore interests without compromise. My mind felt clearer, my heart steadier, my energy more aligned. I realized I had been living in fragments, always dividing myself to meet expectations. Independence allowed me to live as a whole person again, and with wholeness came purpose. I discovered courage in silence. Not the kind of silence that signals emptiness, but the kind that nurtures growth. In that calmness, I regained trust in myself, learning that uncertainty wasn't a threat, but an invitation. I became more intentional with how I spent my time, choosing experiences that fed my spirit instead of draining it. The more intentional I became, the more empowered I felt. Empowerment grew not from what I gained, but from what I released. And that release felt like rebirth. The world around me didn't change, but my perception of it did. I stopped searching for meaning through others and started creating meaning through my own pursuits. My independence became a lens that revealed opportunities I had once overlooked. With every step, I became more aligned with the life I was meant to build, not a life shaped by fear or longing, but by confidence and direction. That direction became my compass, and the compass always pointed toward growth. I see how essential this shift was. Independence didn't take anything from me, it returned everything I had lost. It gave me clarity, strength, purpose, and a renewed sense of self. It allowed me to step into a future designed by my own vision. The path wasn't easy, but it was transformative. And in embracing it fully, I discovered a truth that would shape every chapter that followed. I was never meant to live half-heartedly. I was meant to rise through my own power. Chapter 13, Choosing Solitude Over Settling. Solitude was not something I sought out intentionally at first. It emerged as a quiet option when I began noticing how often I compromised myself to maintain connections that lacked depth. I used to believe companionship, even if shallow, was better than being alone. That belief kept me anchored to situations that drained my energy and blurred my sense of self. As I spent more time reflecting on what I truly wanted, I realized how heavily I had relied on convenience instead of authenticity. The thought of solitude once felt intimidating, yet the thought of settling felt even heavier. That contrast revealed a truth I could no longer ignore. I started recognizing the subtle ways settling appeared in my life, agreeing to plans I had no interest in, tolerating disrespect disguised as affection, forcing emotions that never came naturally. These small compromises collected like stones in my pockets, weighing me down until I could barely move freely. Solitude began to feel like a release, a way to step forward without carrying burdens that were never mine to hold. The more honest I became with myself, the clearer the difference between loneliness and peace grew. What once felt like emptiness transformed into a space ready to be filled with something real. That space invited clarity. Settling had become so normalized around me that choosing differently felt rebellious. Friends often praised relationships that looked stable on the surface, but relied on sacrifice that bordered on self-erasure. I watched people shrink themselves to fit into roles that didn't match who they were becoming. Seeing that made me question my own pattern of bending for acceptance. Solitude began to shimmer with possibility, in contrast to the dull ache of settling. It offered room to breathe, to observe, to understand myself without the noise of expectations. Slowly, that room became a sanctuary, and in that sanctuary, I found strength. I realized how many decisions I had made out of fear: fear of being misunderstood, fear of being left behind, fear of appearing difficult. Those fears pushed me into relationships that lacked connection and into commitments that had no future. When I finally began honoring my discomfort instead of suppressing it, everything shifted. Solitude didn't demand explanations or performance. It welcomed honesty in a way settling never did. I started viewing solitude not as an absence but as an opportunity. And opportunities, especially the quiet ones, often lead to the most profound growth. The relief I felt by choosing solitude surprised me. Instead of feeling small, I felt expansive, as though I had stepped into a larger version of myself. Each day away from situations that once drained me felt like reclaiming pieces of my identity. I realized how much of my life had been shaped around avoiding disappointment instead of pursuing fulfillment. Solitude peeled back layers I had ignored for years, revealing the parts of me that longed for freedom. Freedom to feel deeply, to choose differently, to live boldly. That freedom became my compass. What once felt like giving up started to feel like rising. I used to cling to connections out of hope that they might evolve into something meaningful, even when signs pointed otherwise. Letting go seemed harsh, almost cruel, but keeping myself in places where I felt unseen was far harsher. Solitude taught me that stepping away wasn't abandonment, it was preservation. Preservation of my joy, my energy, and my capacity to grow. The more I embraced this, the more I understood that settling had never been love. It had been fear in disguise. In solitude, I found honesty. Not the kind spoken aloud, but the kind felt in the quiet moments when everything becomes clear. I admitted truths I had avoided: truths about compatibility, desire, self-worth, and boundaries. These acknowledgments didn't break me. They built me. I learned to honor what I deserved rather than chase what I could tolerate. Solitude gave me space to practice self-respect in ways settling had never allowed. And self-respect became the foundation for every decision that followed. I began to enjoy my own company in ways I never expected. Mornings felt softer, evenings felt calmer, and days felt more purposeful as I stopped measuring my worth through interactions that left me depleted. Simple routines became acts of self-care rather than distractions. I realized I didn't need constant engagement to feel valued. My presence alone held meaning. That realization strengthened something within me, a sense of completeness that no relationship could manufacture. It wasn't about avoiding love. It was about understanding that settling was never a substitute for it. Settling had once convinced me that my needs were excessive or inconvenient. Solitude corrected that lie. It reminded me that my desires were valid, my boundaries were necessary, and my happiness was worth prioritizing. The more I honored these truths, the less willing I became to accept anything that required me to shrink. I started imagining a life built on alignment instead of compromise, a life where connection would be chosen intentionally, not out of fear. That vision gave me hope. Hope not for someone else, but for myself. I discovered that solitude wasn't empty, it was reflective. It mirrored back all the versions of me I had outgrown and all the versions I was becoming. It showed me the strength I had underestimated for too long. Every moment spent alone revealed how capable I was, how resilient I had been, and how much more I was meant to experience. Settling had stolen that awareness from me. Solitude returned it, and with that return came confidence I had never felt before. The clarity solitude offered was something settling could never compete with. In quiet moments, I recognized patterns I didn't want to repeat and standards I would no longer abandon. I identified the difference between attention and connection, between convenience and intention, between endurance and compatibility. These distinctions reshaped the way I approached relationships entirely. They guided me to choose myself without guilt. Choosing myself wasn't selfish, it was necessary. I began viewing relationships through a lens that honored my growth instead of my fears. Instead of clinging to potential, I learned to value reality. Instead of romanticizing inconsistent behavior, I learned to appreciate stability rooted in mutual respect. Solitude gave me the patience to understand what I truly needed, and that understanding became a filter for everything I allowed into my life. Settling no longer tempted me the way it once did. The peace I found alone outweighed the comfort of half-hearted companionship. My heart felt lighter as I distanced myself from situations that once held me captive. I stopped apologizing for expecting emotional consistency. I stopped justifying behavior that contradicted my values. I stopped giving chances to people who couldn't meet me where I stood. Solitude taught me that standards aren't walls, they are invitations for genuine connection. And genuine connection cannot grow in places shaped by settling. That truth reshaped the way I carried myself. Solitude became more than a choice. It became a lifestyle rooted in intention. I learned to make decisions that honored my emotional well-being rather than my fears. I embraced activities that nourished my spirit and surrounded myself with environments that encouraged growth. Settling had once convinced me that choosing less was safer. Solitude revealed that choosing more for myself was the true path to abundance. And once abundance appeared, scarcity no longer intimidated me. I realized that solitude wasn't the absence of companionship. It was the presence of self-awareness. It guided me to cultivate a life that didn't rely on validation or temporary distractions. I learned to trust my instincts and to walk away before losing myself. Settling had kept me confined to narratives that didn't reflect my worth. Solitude helped me write new ones. Narratives filled with purpose, strength, and clarity. Narratives that honored the person I was becoming. Choosing solitude over settling became the most transformative decision of my life. It aligned me with my truth, restored my sense of worth, and opened the path to a future built on intention. I no longer feared being alone because solitude had shown me the richness of my own company. It taught me that fulfillment doesn't come from proximity, it comes from authenticity. And authenticity was something I could only find once I stopped settling and finally chose myself. Chapter 3. The strength I found in my own reflection. I used to avoid looking too closely at myself because I feared what I might uncover beneath the surface. My reflection felt like a reminder of all the things I hadn't become, all the expectations I had not met, and all the choices I questioned. But when solitude became a part of my life, the mirror no longer felt like an enemy. It became a quiet doorway to understanding. I began to see not what I lacked, but what I had ignored for far too long. The person staring back at me wasn't weak at all, just overlooked. And that realization changed everything. As I spent more time alone, my reflection became clearer in more ways than one. I noticed the strength in my eyes, the resilience in my posture, and the calmness in my expression. These weren't qualities I had suddenly acquired. They had been there, masked by years of self-doubt and comparison. Without the noise of outside opinions, I could finally hear my own truth. That truth revealed a version of me that had been waiting to be acknowledged. The more I observed myself honestly, the more empowered I became. Strength, I realized, had been hiding in plain sight. The mirror reflected not only who I was, but also what I had endured. It showed a person who had navigated heartbreak, disappointment, and uncertainty without ever truly collapsing. I saw someone who had carried emotional weight with quiet endurance, never giving herself enough credit for the battles she fought internally. Seeing this made me appreciate my resilience in a way I never had before. Every scar I noticed became a symbol of survival rather than defeat. My reflection wasn't a reminder of fragile moments, it was a record of perseverance. Understanding myself required courage, a kind I didn't know I possessed. Sitting with my own thoughts felt uncomfortable at first, as if layers of truth were peeling away whether I was ready or not. But that discomfort pushed me toward growth. Looking into my reflection forced me to acknowledge the strength I had overlooked because I was too focused on pleasing others. I began to recognize how much of my value I had given away, hoping someone else would affirm it. Now, affirmation came from within, from the steady gaze I met every morning. The more I connected with myself, the more I realized how rarely I had practiced genuine self-compassion. I had forgiven others countless times, yet held myself to impossible standards. My reflection showed the tiredness of those expectations, but also the determination underneath. With every day that passed, I learned to treat myself with the same kindness I once reserved for others. That shift softened the harshness of my inner voice and encouraged a more nurturing dialogue. Strength didn't always appear loud. Sometimes it appeared in gentleness. I discovered that my reflection held wisdom I had ignored while chasing validation. It reminded me of the promises I made to myself but never honored. It reminded me of the dreams I postponed because I believed someone else's path mattered more. As I confronted these truths, I didn't feel guilt. I felt awakening to the fact that my life carried potential untouched by the limitations I once accepted. Seeing myself clearly helped me reclaim that potential, and reclaiming it gave me purpose. Each day I stood before the mirror, I noticed changes that went beyond the physical. My eyes carried more certainty, my expression more confidence, my presence more assurance. It wasn't about appearance, it was about alignment. I was aligning with who I was meant to be all along. The reflection I once critiqued now felt like an ally, guiding me towards self-discovery. I learned to celebrate progress instead of criticizing imperfections. Through this shift, I grew stronger not by changing myself, but by recognizing who I already was. The strength I found in my reflection came from honesty. Honest acceptance of my flaws, my talents, my regrets, and my desires. Instead of hiding them, I allowed myself to confront them without judgment. That honesty didn't break me, it liberated me. I understood that growth didn't mean becoming someone new. It meant embracing every part of the person I had become through experience. My reflection served as a witness to that evolution, and witnessing it made me braver. I realized how long I had underestimated my ability to stand on my own. My reflection reminded me that independence wasn't an act of isolation, but a declaration of self-trust. I began acknowledging the times I had supported myself emotionally, mentally, and even spiritually without seeking help. Those quiet victories had gone unnoticed because I was too busy waiting for someone to recognize them. Now, I recognized them myself. And through that recognition, I embraced my power. My reflection revealed the strength in stillness, the kind that comes from sitting with emotions instead of distracting myself from them. I learned how to process disappointment without numbing it, how to face fears without running, and how to comfort myself without external affirmation. Each time I returned to the mirror after facing something difficult, I saw more resilience than the day before. It reminded me that healing wasn't linear, but it was always possible, and that possibility kept me moving forward. In those quiet moments of reflection, I began rewriting the narrative I once believed about myself. I replaced doubt with certainty, insecurity with awareness, and fear with courage. These shifts weren't dramatic. They were subtle, steady, and deeply meaningful. I started trusting the guidance of my intuition more than the opinions of others. That trust created a new sense of inner stability, and with stability came confidence that no external situation could easily shake. My reflection became a place of accountability. It held me responsible for maintaining the promises I made to myself about boundaries, self-care, and emotional well-being. Each day, I faced the person who would live with the consequences of my choices. That awareness encouraged me to choose wisely. I understood that betraying myself for comfort or convenience would only lead me back to the emptiness I had worked so hard to leave behind. Strength grew each time I honored my own needs. The mirror also revealed gratitude for my resilience, for my ability to adapt, and for my willingness to grow. I learned to appreciate the qualities that once felt inconvenient or misunderstood. My sensitivity became insight. My independence became confidence. My solitude became clarity. Each of these traits reflected who I truly was, not who others expected me to be. Recognizing this strengthened my sense of identity in a profound way. I discovered that my reflection wasn't only about the past, it was about the future as well. It showed the person I was becoming. Someone who chose peace over chaos, self-worth over external approval, and authenticity over performance. It reminded me that I had the power to shape my life intentionally. The strength I found within myself became a guiding force, influencing every decision that followed. I stopped seeking stability in others because I had finally found it within. Looking at my reflection no longer felt intimidating. It felt empowering. I saw a person who had grown through adversity, reclaimed her sense of self, and embraced a path that honored her truth. The strength I found was not a sudden discovery, but a gradual realization built through self-exploration and acceptance. It grounded me more deeply than any external source ever had. And from that grounding emerged a new chapter of my life, one built on inner power, clarity, and unwavering self-respect. Chapter 4. How walking alone led me to myself. Walking alone was not something I romanticized at first. It felt unfamiliar, like stepping into a path with no guide and no guarantee. Yet, the more I distanced myself from connections that once defined my days, the more I realized how necessary the distance was. Every quiet step allowed my thoughts to breathe, revealing truths I had buried beneath noise and obligation. I started sensing a deeper connection to myself, one I had ignored while chasing the comfort of company. That connection pulled me inward, and inward was exactly where I needed to go. I learned that solitude wasn't just a state of being. It was an experience that reshaped the way I viewed my life. Each walk away from the familiar opened a space where I could reflect without interference. I stopped carrying the weight of other people's expectations and started noticing how light my spirit felt without those burdens. My steps became steadier, not because life got easier, but because I finally understood that I didn't need approval to move forward. Moving forward began to feel like liberation. Liberation that grew stronger each day. The journey inward often felt uncomfortable, but discomfort is sometimes the first sign of transformation. As I walked further into independence, I confronted parts of myself I had long avoided. I uncovered insecurities, fears, dreams, and desires that had been pushed aside to satisfy others. Facing these parts was challenging, yet it awakened a new honesty within me. That honesty guided me toward a deeper sense of identity, and identity became the foundation of my strength. Each solitary step revealed patterns I had repeated without noticing. I saw how often I had sacrificed my peace to keep relationships from falling apart. I saw how frequently I dimmed my voice to avoid conflict. As I acknowledged these patterns, I felt a mix of grief and clarity. Grief for the years I had ignored myself. Clarity for the opportunity to grow beyond those habits. Walking alone invited me to release what no longer supported my evolution. That release felt necessary. The more time I spent in my own company, the more I discovered the quiet beauty within it. I found comfort in making decisions based solely on my intuition, without the influence of outside voices. I noticed how naturally confidence grew when I listened to myself without second-guessing. Solitude allowed me to reconnect with older versions of myself, the ones who once believed wholeheartedly in possibility. Those versions reminded me of my resilience, and that reminder brought healing. I realized that walking alone didn't mean rejecting connection. It meant choosing authenticity over obligation. I stopped entertaining relationships that lacked depth or mutual respect. Instead, I focused on nurturing the bond I had with myself. Each intentional step strengthened my understanding of what truly aligned with my heart. Alignment became more important than convenience. And with alignment came peace unlike anything I had known before. The silence I found in solitude became a powerful teacher. It showed me how much energy I had wasted trying to decode mixed signals and inconsistent affection. In silence, everything felt clear. Even the difficult truths I once avoided. I learned to embrace clarity, even when it required uncomfortable choices. Those choices were acts of self-care, disguised as decisions. And self-care slowly rebuilt the foundation of my identity. Walking alone gave me the courage to rewrite narratives I had unconsciously accepted. I stopped seeing myself as someone who needed to be chosen to feel valued. I started viewing myself as someone capable of choosing with intention. This shift allowed me to step into a new chapter, one where my worth was no longer tied to someone else's presence. I finally understood that solitude wasn't a void. It was room to grow. The more I walked, the more I understood how deeply I had underestimated my capacity for self-direction. I learned to navigate uncertainty with patience instead of panic. I learned to trust the process instead of rushing to fill emotional gaps with temporary comfort. Each time I chose myself, the path ahead became a little clearer. That clarity created momentum. Momentum that pushed me toward transformation. I discovered parts of myself that had been overshadowed by years of compromising. Creativity resurfaced, ambition returned, and desires that once felt distant came back into focus. Walking alone allowed me to access these forgotten pieces freely, without judgment, without hesitation, without apology. I realized that independence was not the absence of love, it was the presence of possibility, and possibility became a guiding light. I stopped trying to rush my growth. I let each experience unfold naturally, allowing myself the grace to learn from every step. This patience helped me understand the value of going at my own pace. No comparison, no pressure, just progress rooted in authenticity. The path I walked was mine alone, shaped by my choices and guided by my intuition. That self-guidance strengthened my confidence. Confidence that felt earned, not borrowed. Walking alone allowed me to view the world with a different lens. I began noticing small joys, quiet mornings, meaningful conversations, moments of stillness that once felt insignificant. These moments grounded me, reminding me that life doesn't need constant excitement to feel fulfilling. Fulfillment came from alignment with my inner truth, and the more aligned I felt, the more grateful I became. I learned that solitude invited deeper reflection, and reflection invited growth. I became more intentional with my boundaries, my time, and the energy I allowed into my life. I no longer felt the need to justify my choices to anyone. The more I honored myself, the easier it became to recognize what belonged in my life and what didn't. That recognition became a compass that guided my steps with clarity. Clarity that felt liberating. Each step alone helped me understand the strength within my vulnerability. I allowed myself to feel emotions fully instead of suppressing them. This emotional honesty built resilience that stood firm even in moments of uncertainty. I no longer viewed vulnerability as weakness. It became evidence of my willingness to grow, and growth became a source of pride. I stopped expecting others to provide the support I had the ability to give myself. I started recognizing how capable I was of rebuilding, redirecting, and renewing my path whenever necessary. Walking alone taught me the value of self-reliance without turning me into someone closed off. Instead, it shaped me into someone grounded enough to welcome authentic connection when it arrived. Groundedness transformed my perspective. As I grew more comfortable in solitude, I realized how much energy I had gained from leaving behind situations that no longer aligned with my spirit. The freedom to prioritize myself felt empowering. I didn't have to shrink, compromise, or negotiate my worth. I could simply exist as myself without fear of being too much or not enough. That freedom nurtured confidence that radiated inward first. The journey alone helped me reconnect with passions I had abandoned. I began exploring interests that once brought me joy, rediscovering excitement in learning, creating, and dreaming. Every step of this exploration felt like returning home to parts of myself I had forgotten. These rediscovered passions fueled my inner fire, and that fire illuminated new paths I never imagined walking before. Walking alone reshaped the way I approached challenges. Instead of avoiding discomfort, I learned to step toward it with curiosity. Each obstacle became an opportunity to understand myself better. I no longer felt powerless when life shifted unexpectedly. I adapted with strength, knowing I had faced uncertainty before and grown because of it. My resilience became unwavering, and unwavering resilience became my anchor. The further I walked into independence, the more I recognized the depth of my emotional capacity. I could hold hope and heartbreak, courage and fear, clarity and confusion, all without losing myself. I understood that walking alone didn't require detachment. It required awareness. Awareness of what I carried, what I released, and what I invited in. Awareness that strengthened my sense of self at every turn. Walking alone didn't feel like a journey away from others. It felt like a journey toward myself. I found meaning in places I once overlooked, and strength in moments I once feared. The deeper I went, the more I realized that solitude had not isolated me. It had reunited me with my essence. This reconnection became the most valuable gift of my path, a gift that shaped my future. By embracing this journey, I discovered a version of myself that felt whole, grounded, and aligned with purpose. Walking alone revealed truths I had buried, strengths I had doubted, and dreams I had delayed. It showed me that the path to self-discovery isn't always comfortable, but it is always worthwhile. I found myself not through others, but through the courage to walk alone. And in finding myself, I began truly living. Chapter 5. Turning my pain into personal power. Pain shaped my life long before I learned how to understand it. I carried it quietly through my days, pretending it didn't influence the choices I made or the way I saw myself. For years, I treated pain like an unwelcome shadow instead of the teacher it eventually became. I ran from it, buried it, softened it, and sometimes disguised it with distractions. But no matter how far I tried to move, it always found a way to resurface. Only when I stopped resisting did I begin to uncover the strength hidden inside it. I discovered that pain intensified whenever I refused to acknowledge it. Ignoring it only stretched its presence deeper into my thoughts, influencing how I reacted to even the smallest inconveniences. Every unresolved emotion sat beneath my calm exterior, waiting for permission to be released. When I finally allowed myself to feel without judgment, the heaviness began to shift. Pain was no longer a force that controlled me. It became a signal pointing toward what needed healing. That shift marked the beginning of my transformation. As I reflected on my past, I realized how often I had minimized experiences that had deeply affected me. I convinced myself they were insignificant because admitting their impact felt like admitting weakness. But recognizing the truth didn't make me weak. It revealed how strong I had been all along. Each hardship carried lessons I had overlooked while trying to stay composed. Understanding this gave me a deeper appreciation for the resilience I had developed quietly. That resilience became the foundation of my new strength. I learned that pain rarely arrives without purpose, even when its presence feels overwhelming. It exposes unresolved wounds, challenges old beliefs, and forces growth in ways comfort never could. The moments that hurt the most often revealed parts of me I had neglected. They showed me where I needed boundaries, where I needed self-worth, and where I needed clarity. Instead of rejecting these revelations, I began welcoming them. Welcoming them allowed me to transform emotional wounds into sources of empowerment. Processing my pain required patience and honesty, two things I hadn't always given myself. Some memories resurfaced with sharp clarity, demanding attention I had avoided for years. Instead of rushing to suppress them, I allowed myself to sit with them and understand their origins. This exploration brought discomfort, yet each realization felt like peeling away layers that no longer served me. Healing didn't erase the past. It helped me interpret it differently, and that new understanding softened the power pain once held over me. There were days when I questioned whether healing would ever feel complete. Old emotions resurfaced unexpectedly, reminding me that growth isn't linear. But each time I faced the discomfort, instead of avoiding it, I felt myself becoming stronger. My capacity to handle emotional weight expanded. I no longer feared pain returning because I trusted myself to navigate it. That trust replaced the uncertainty that once ruled my life. In trust, I found courage. The more I explored my pain, the more I realized how deeply it had influenced my identity. It shaped the way I loved, the way I set boundaries, and the way I valued myself. Acknowledging these connections gave me the power to break cycles I had repeated unconsciously. I no longer needed to respond from old wounds. I could respond from awareness. That awareness freed me from patterns that once drained my spirit, and freedom became a gift I gave myself. Pain revealed truths about relationships I once romanticized. I saw how often I had accepted less than I deserved because I feared disappointment. I recognized how often I tolerated inconsistency because I believed care required sacrifice. These realizations didn't fill me with anger, they filled me with clarity. Clarity that helped me distinguish between love and attachment, between presence and effort, between interest and intention. With clarity, I set higher standards, and those standards protected my peace. As I healed, I began transforming emotional hurt into determination. The same pain that once paralyzed me now pushed me toward growth. I used it as fuel to create a life that honored my worth instead of diminishing it. The more I reclaimed control over my emotions, the more empowered I felt. That empowerment sparked motivation I hadn't felt in years. It inspired me to pursue dreams I once believed were out of reach. Pain became the catalyst for ambition. Understanding my pain also reshaped the way I viewed vulnerability. I realized vulnerability wasn't a risk, it was a bridge to authenticity. Allowing myself to be open didn't invite harm, it invited healing. Through vulnerability, I accessed layers of strength I didn't know existed. I no longer needed to portray myself as unbothered to feel powerful. Real power came from embracing every emotion, even the ones that once felt too heavy to carry. That emotional honesty grounded me. I learned to forgive myself for choices made during difficult times. Pain often narrows perception, convincing you that survival is the only goal. When I look back with compassion instead of criticism, I understood why I made certain decisions. Forgiveness lifted weight from my shoulders and reminded me that growth comes from progression, not perfection. This forgiveness strengthened my relationship with myself. A stronger relationship with myself became the ultimate source of empowerment. Pain also taught me how to recognize my emotional thresholds. I became more aware of what drained me, what triggered old wounds, and what nurtured healing. With this awareness, I could set boundaries that honored my well-being. These boundaries weren't barriers, they were expressions of self-worth. Maintaining them required consistency and courage, but each act of protection reinforced my strength. Boundaries became a declaration of power rather than fear. As I continued healing, I noticed how pain transformed into wisdom. Experiences that once felt impossible to process now offered insight into who I was becoming. I developed a deeper understanding of my emotional landscape, recognizing how each struggle contributed to my growth. This awareness allowed me to navigate future challenges with more resilience. Resilience became a quiet confidence that followed me everywhere. That confidence changed the way I carried myself. Pain became a reminder that I was capable of rebuilding. Even when situations shattered my expectations, I found ways to piece myself back together. Each reconstruction revealed a stronger version of me, more grounded, more self-aware, more intentional. I no longer feared falling apart because I trusted my ability to rise. Rising after hardship became part of my identity, and that identity was rooted in strength. Walking through pain required confronting uncomfortable truths, yet those truths illuminated paths I had never considered. I recognized how much potential I had relinquished while trying to avoid discomfort. When I embraced the lessons pain offered, I felt myself stepping into a wider horizon. Possibilities expanded where limitations once stood. With each step forward, I reclaimed agency over my story. Agency that felt liberating. The more I transformed pain into power, the more I understood the importance of emotional responsibility. I no longer projected unresolved wounds onto others or allowed them to dictate my decisions. Instead, I acknowledged them, learned from them, and released them. This responsibility created balance within me, balance that stabilized my emotions and strengthened my judgment. Stability became a form of strength I learned to trust. Healing allowed me to connect with myself on a deeper level. I became more attuned to my needs, desires, and emotional rhythms. I started honoring my intuition rather than dismissing it. This inner connection became a guiding force that helped me make decisions with clarity and confidence. Confidence rooted in self-trust felt different, stronger, steadier, more sustainable. It empowered me to shape my life intentionally. As I embraced this transformation, I realized pain had not broken me. It had sculpted me. It carved out resilience, patience, and a deeper understanding of what it meant to value myself. Through every challenge, I uncovered a strength that remained hidden until I needed it most. That strength became undeniable as I learned to stand firmly in who I was. Standing firmly became my source of pride. Pain eventually transitioned from something I feared to something I respected. It became a symbol of growth, a reminder of everything I had overcome, and an affirmation of my emotional evolution. I no longer saw it as an obstacle, but as a catalyst that shaped the person I was becoming. Every lesson carved from pain added meaning to my journey, meaning that enriched my sense of purpose. Turning my pain into personal power became one of the greatest transformations of my life. It taught me to embrace healing, honor my emotions, and recognize the strength within my vulnerability. Pain no longer dictated my path. It guided me toward a stronger, wiser, more empowered version of myself. I emerged from it not defeated, but awakened. Awakened to my resilience, my potential, and my ability to rise from anything. That awakening shaped the foundation of who I am now. Chapter 6. Building a life that doesn't need validation. For most of my life, I didn't realize how heavily I relied on the opinions of others to measure my own value. Every decision, big or small, passed through the filter of what someone else might think. I shaped my personality around acceptance, softened my boundaries to avoid conflict, and chose paths that looked admirable rather than meaningful. When I stepped into independence, I was forced to confront how little of my life truly reflected my authentic desires. That realization became the starting point for building a life supported by my own truth. Validation had worked like an invisible currency I spent constantly, hoping to receive approval in return. The more I depended on it, the more unstable I felt. My emotions rose and fell based on reactions that were never mine to control. It took time to understand that living this way was not sustainable. I needed a foundation rooted in something deeper than praise or reassurance. That foundation required introspection, honesty, and the willingness to let go of habits that once felt comforting. Letting go opened the space I needed to grow. Building a life without validation began with reclaiming my voice. I learned to speak without rehearsing, to express my truth without reshaping it for someone else's comfort. The more I practiced honesty, the more natural it became. I discovered that authenticity didn't depend on whether people agreed with me. It depended on whether I honored myself. Every time I chose my own voice over external approval, I felt a piece of my confidence return. Confidence that had been buried under years of people-pleasing. As I grew more comfortable expressing my truth, I also learned to differentiate between support and control. Some people offered advice that aligned with my well-being, while others projected their fears onto my choices. Recognizing this distinction helped me become more intentional about the energy I allowed in my life. I no longer felt obligated to carry the weight of opinions that didn't consider my growth. Protecting my mental space became a new form of self-care, and self-care strengthened my independence. I realized how often validation had influenced the dreams I pursued. Some goals were chosen because they looked impressive, not because they resonated with my spirit. When I stripped away the need for recognition, I found passions that had been silenced for years. These passions felt genuine, unforced, and deeply fulfilling. I began building a life around what inspired me rather than what impressed others. That shift reshaped my sense of direction that aligned with my inner truth. Creating a life without external approval required learning to trust my instincts. For years, I second-guessed myself because I believed others knew better. But with independence, I discovered how precise my intuition had always been. It guided me through challenges, warned me about misaligned connections, and encouraged me toward opportunities I once feared pursuing. Trusting it felt like stepping into clarity that made decision-making less stressful and more intentional. I learned that a meaningful life wasn't built overnight. It required consistent effort to release old habits, question inherited beliefs, and redefine my priorities. Some days were easier than others, but every step forward felt like progress. I stopped measuring my worth through productivity or validation and began valuing the internal shifts that reshaped my mindset. These shifts created steady growth that became more important than perfection. As I detached from the need for validation, I became more aware of the environments that fed my insecurities. Spaces that once felt comfortable revealed themselves as limiting. I gradually distanced myself from situations that thrived on competition, judgment, or comparison. In their absence, I found peace in spaces where I could simply exist without performing. Peace became my new standard. And anything that disrupted that peace became easy to release. The more I relied on my own voice, the more I understood the importance of boundaries. Without boundaries, I had allowed people to influence my decisions far more than they should have. Establishing boundaries didn't mean shutting others out. It meant protecting my emotional autonomy. It meant prioritizing my growth without guilt. These boundaries helped me create a life rooted in self-respect. Self-respect became the soil where my confidence finally grew. I began celebrating my achievements privately, rather than seeking applause. Achievements felt more meaningful when they came from genuine effort instead of external expectation. I no longer rushed to share every milestone, nor did I rely on others to confirm its value. This allowed me to enjoy my progress in a deeper, more personal way. Personal satisfaction replaced the chase for recognition, and that satisfaction felt far more grounding. Living without validation also meant embracing moments of uncertainty. Without constant reassurance, I had to build trust in myself from the ground up. At first, it felt intimidating, but the more decisions I made independently, the stronger my internal compass became. I learned to navigate uncertainty with curiosity rather than doubt. Curiosity opened perspectives I had never considered before. Those perspectives broadened my understanding of who I could become. I noticed how much clearer my goals became when they weren't shaped by expectations. My ambitions shifted from what sounded admirable to what felt meaningful. That distinction guided me toward experiences that nurtured my growth instead of diluting my identity. I no longer needed external permission to dream boldly. Dreaming boldly became a natural extension of believing in myself, and belief became the driving force behind each new chapter. As I continued building this life, I became more intentional about the relationships I welcomed. I looked for connections rooted in authenticity rather than validation. I valued conversations that encouraged growth rather than fed insecurity. The more I embraced independence, the easier it became to identify relationships that aligned with my values. Alignment created harmony in my life, harmony that had been missing for far too long. I learned to enjoy solitude without feeling the urge to justify it. Solitude provided clarity that no amount of external stimulation could replace. It allowed me to sit with my thoughts, understand my emotions, and make choices based on what felt right for me. In solitude, I learned to appreciate my own presence, appreciation that didn't rely on anyone else's validation. That inner contentment became a core part of my strength. Detaching from external approval also changed the way I viewed setbacks. Instead of perceiving them as failures, I began seeing them as opportunities for growth. I no longer feared making mistakes because I no longer feared judgment. Mistakes became stepping stones toward a deeper understanding of myself. Each experience, whether smooth or challenging, contributed to my evolution. Evolution became the reward, not validation. As I stepped further into independence, I became aware of how easily validation once influenced my emotional state. Now, my emotions felt more balanced because they were no longer dependent on outside responses. I learned to regulate my feelings through self-awareness and honesty. This emotional stability strengthened my confidence in ways external approval never could. Stability became a reflection of my inner growth. I realized that living authentically required releasing the illusion of perfection. Perfection was a mask I wore to earn acceptance, but it only distanced me from my true self. When I let go of that mask, I felt lighter, freer, more human. Being real became more important than being impressive. Realness created space for genuine connection, and genuine connection enriched my journey. Building a life without validation also meant learning to celebrate my individuality. I embraced quirks I once hid, passions I once downplayed, and dreams I once suppressed. I began honoring every part of myself without apology. This acceptance expanded my sense of identity that no longer needed external confirmation. That internal freedom felt empowering. As I reflected on my growth, I realized that validation had once controlled my every move. Now, it held no power over my choices or my self-worth. I shaped my life based on what nourished my spirit, supported my growth, and aligned with my truth. This autonomy became a testament to how far I had come. Autonomy strengthened my sense of purpose. By building a life that didn't need validation, I found a deeper connection with myself than I ever thought possible. I learned to trust my instincts, honor my emotions, and make choices without seeking approval. I discovered that self-worth comes from within, not from applause or recognition. Living this way allowed me to build a future rooted in authenticity. Authenticity became the foundation of the life I was creating. Each step on this path brought me closer to understanding my true potential. I no longer needed external voices to confirm my direction or my value. I built a life centered around self-respect, purpose, and inner certainty. That life reflected the person I was becoming, someone strong, grounded, and unapologetically authentic. And in embracing that authenticity, I discovered a confidence that no amount of validation could ever provide. Chapter 7. Rising above expectations and breaking the mold. From a young age, countless expectations shaped the path I believed I had to follow. Expectations from family, society, and even versions of myself that no longer existed. I learned to measure success through standards I never created and tried to fit into roles that felt too small for the person I was becoming. Over time, the pressure to meet these expectations grew heavier, as if my worth depended entirely on how well I fit into someone else's mold. Eventually, I realized that following a predetermined script wouldn't lead to fulfillment. It would only distance me from my true identity. As I stepped into independence, those expectations became louder, almost as if the world didn't know how to interpret a life that didn't follow traditional patterns. People questioned my choices, projected their fears, and tried to guide me back into familiar shapes. But the more they insisted, the more I sensed how deeply I craved a life created from my own vision rather than borrowed ideals. Breaking away wasn't an act of rebellion, it was an act of survival. I needed space to grow into someone who felt genuine to me. It became clear that molds weren't designed for individuals. They were designed for conformity. They encouraged predictability and discouraged exploration. Whenever I tried to fit into them, I felt my identity thinning, as if I had to trim away essential parts of myself just to belong. Recognizing this helped me understand why I had felt disconnected for so long. I wasn't failing to meet expectations. The expectations were failing to reflect who I was. Letting go of them became my first step toward liberation. Walking away from those expectations meant facing the discomfort of uncertainty. When you've lived your life trying to satisfy others, forging your own path can feel unfamiliar and even frightening. But in that discomfort, I discovered a sense of possibility I had never felt before. Without obligations dictating my decisions, I could explore what genuinely resonated with my heart. Each new choice brought me closer to the life I envisioned, rather than the life others imagined for me. That alignment felt empowering. I realized that rising above expectations required understanding where they came from. Many were built from generational patterns, cultural pressure, and unspoken rules passed down without question. It wasn't that these expectations were malicious. They simply weren't designed for my individual path. Understanding this allowed me to release resentment and step forward with clarity. I could honor where I came from, while still choosing a future that matched my truth. That balance offered a new sense of freedom. Breaking the mold involved questioning narratives I once believed were absolute. I challenged the idea that success meant following a linear path, that fulfillment required partnership, and that happiness depended on external achievements. As I examined these beliefs, I realized how much power they held over my past choices. Releasing them felt like shedding layers of identities I had outgrown. In their absence, I felt more capable of defining my life on my own terms. That definition became a reflection of my evolving strength. Choosing a path outside the mold often meant facing misunderstanding. Some people saw my choices as strange or risky because they didn't align with traditional expectations. I learned to accept that not everyone would understand my journey, and that understanding was not required for me to continue moving. What mattered was my commitment to living authentically, even when others didn't see the beauty in that authenticity. Their confusion no longer shaped my direction. My truth guided me instead. As I grew more confident in my choices, I noticed how deeply ingrained expectations were in the people around me. Many lived according to patterns they never questioned, fearing the consequences of stepping outside them. Observing this reminded me why breaking the mold mattered. It wasn't about rejecting norms for the sake of it. It was about giving myself permission to explore what felt meaningful. That permission opened doors I never knew existed. Through them, I discovered parts of myself long ignored. Stepping away from expectations also meant accepting that growth could disrupt comfort. Some relationships faded because they were built on versions of me that no longer felt authentic. Instead of grieving these losses, I learned to see them as natural transitions. When authenticity enters, anything built on pretense eventually falls away. These shifts created space for new connections rooted in alignment rather than obligation. Alignment enriched my sense of belonging in ways expectations never could. Breaking the mold encouraged me to redefine success in a way that honored my journey. Success became less about external milestones and more about internal harmony. I began to appreciate the strength it took to choose myself, the courage it required to walk away from traditional paths, and the freedom that came from embracing uncertainty. I no longer needed validation to feel accomplished. My growth became its own reward, and that reward felt deeply fulfilling. With each step forward, I learned that rising above expectations required resilience. Sometimes the pressures returned, whispering doubts and urging me to return to comfort. But every time I chose authenticity over fear, my resilience grew stronger. I started believing in my ability to create a meaningful life without relying on familiar structures. That belief became a steady source of motivation that pushed me to keep evolving. I began recognizing how restrictive molds could be not just for me but for anyone trying to build a unique life. They discouraged individuality, silenced creativity, and punished deviation. By breaking free, I felt like I was reclaiming a part of myself I'd been forced to hide. This reclamation allowed me to explore my identity with curiosity rather than judgment. Curiosity brought a sense of excitement to my growth. That excitement fueled my transformation. The more I distanced myself from expectations, the more aware I became of the endless possibilities available to me. I saw paths that once felt closed, dreams that once felt unrealistic, and choices that once felt impossible. These possibilities expanded my perspective and reminded me that life didn't have to follow a fixed blueprint. I was free to revise, redirect, and reinvent whenever necessary. Reinvention became a powerful expression of self-love. Embracing a path outside the mold also taught me the value of intentional living. Instead of drifting through life on autopilot, I started making decisions rooted in purpose. Purpose guided me toward environments that nurtured my growth and away from situations that drained it. I learned to listen to my intuition without dismissing it. That inner guidance became a reliable compass, a compass I trusted more with each passing day. As I rose above expectations, I discovered a deeper sense of self-respect. I no longer allowed others to dictate my pace, my goals, or my identity. I learned to stand firm in my boundaries and honor my emotional needs without apology. This self-respect created a foundation strong enough to support my dreams. It reminded me that I was worthy of living a life shaped by my own hands, worthy of choosing my own direction. The process of breaking the mold taught me to embrace uncertainty with confidence. Instead of fearing the unknown, I learned to see it as a space filled with potential. The unfamiliar became a place where growth could flourish. I stopped seeking guarantees and started trusting my capacity to adapt. Adaptability gave me strength beyond anything expectations ever offered. That strength helped me face every new chapter with courage. As my sense of identity deepened, I understood that expectations could no longer define me. They were temporary structures built from opinions that reflected other people's experiences, not mine. Releasing them allowed me to see myself clearly, without distortion, limitation, or comparison. This clarity revealed the expansive nature of my individuality that deserved expression without restraint. Rising above expectations became a journey of reclaiming power I once gave away too easily. Each time I chose my path over someone else's vision, I felt more rooted in my purpose. I began creating a life filled with choices that honored my desires instead of my fears. These choices stitched together a future that felt genuine, a future shaped not by pressure, but by passion. Breaking the mold allowed me to evolve into a version of myself I had only glimpsed in brief moments of honesty. This version was confident, grounded, curious, and unafraid of standing alone. I learned to celebrate the distance between who I was taught to be and who I was becoming. That distance represented growth, growth that I earned through courage and commitment. By rising above expectations, I stepped into a life rooted in freedom, identity, and purpose. I no longer felt confined by predetermined roles or limited by traditional narratives. Instead, I embraced a path that reflected my truth. Building this path required resilience, courage, and unwavering self-awareness. But the reward was a sense of authenticity I had been searching for all my life. And with authenticity came the realization that I was finally living not for others, but for myself. Chapter 8. Becoming the hero of my own story. I spent much of my life waiting for someone to arrive and rewrite the parts of my story that felt unfinished. I believed that rescue would come through relationships, opportunities, or validation that somehow made everything make sense. But as I grew into independence, I realized no one could step into my life and fix what I had avoided addressing. Every unanswered question, every unhealed wound, every unspoken truth remained mine to face. Accepting this wasn't discouraging, it was empowering. It meant I had the ability to shape my destiny. The idea of becoming my own hero felt distant at first, almost unrealistic, as if it required a level of courage I wasn't sure I possessed. Yet, every time I chose myself over fear, a small part of that courage revealed itself. Those moments showed me that heroism wasn't defined by dramatic gestures. It was formed through quiet decisions, decisions that protected my peace, honored my worth, and guided me toward growth. With time, those decisions stitched together a new kind of strength, a strength I could rely on. I learned that taking control of my story didn't require perfection. It required presence. I had to be willing to stand fully in my truth, even when that truth disrupted patterns I once clung to. I stopped hiding behind excuses and began taking responsibility for my choices. This responsibility was not a burden, but a sign of maturity, a sign that I was capable of handling whatever came next. Each step I took toward accountability expanded my confidence. And from that confidence, a deeper sense of self emerged. Becoming my own hero meant confronting the fears I had avoided for years. I had feared failure, judgment, and disappointment so intensely that I often paused my progress before I even began. But when I faced these fears head on, I saw they had only held power because I never challenged them. By dismantling them piece by piece, I created space for possibilities I had once dismissed. The more I challenged my fears, the less control they had over my life. This shift opened doors to new opportunities. I realized a hero isn't someone who avoids hardship, but someone who learns to navigate it with resilience. Hardships no longer felt like signs of inadequacy. They became invitations to develop strength. Each obstacle taught me something valuable about my capacity, my endurance, and my ability to rebuild. I started seeing setbacks not as endings, but as chapters that prepared me for breakthroughs. This mindset allowed me to move with more intention that anchored me through uncertainty. One of the most powerful steps in becoming my own hero was learning to silence the voices that once dictated my worth. I stopped internalizing opinions that minimized my potential or questioned my choices. Instead, I cultivated an inner voice built on encouragement, clarity, and truth. That voice became my guide, reminding me that my path did not require approval. With every decision I made based on self-belief, I strengthened the foundation of my story, a foundation that could not be shaken by doubt. As I grew more confident, I recognized how often I had waited for permission to live boldly, permission to pursue my dreams, express my desires, or change directions when something no longer aligned. When I realized that permission had always been mine to give, everything shifted. I no longer waited for ideal conditions to take action. I simply began. Beginning empowered me more than any reassurance ever could. It proved that courage grows with movement. Becoming the hero meant defining success through my own lens. Instead of striving for milestones that looked impressive, I focused on achievements that nourished my spirit. Some victories were small and quiet, others transformative, but all reflected my growth. I stopped comparing my journey to others and learned to appreciate the uniqueness of my path. This appreciation taught me to celebrate progress without rushing the outcome. Progress itself became a triumph. I learned that heroes are not fearless. They are brave enough to act despite fear. I embraced vulnerability as part of my strength rather than something to conceal. Showing up authentically felt risky at times. Yet each moment of honesty deepened my connection with myself. Vulnerability revealed layers of courage I never knew existed. Those layers formed the backbone of the person I was becoming. A person grounded in truth, not pretense. Taking control of my story also required letting go of roles that no longer represented who I wanted to be. I released identities shaped by obligation, expectation, and fear. This release was unsettling, yet it allowed space for new aspects of myself to emerge. I learned to trust evolution rather than cling to familiarity. With each version of myself that unfolded, I felt more aligned. Alignment became the compass guiding my transformation. One of the greatest revelations was understanding that I did not need saving. I needed support, growth, understanding, and connection, but not rescue. Realizing this shifted my entire perspective on relationships. I began looking for partnerships built on mutual respect rather than dependency. This shift empowered me to love more authentically. Authentic love complemented my strength instead of replacing it. Heroism also meant embracing solitude with confidence. Being alone no longer felt like something to escape. It became a powerful space for reflection and renewal. I discovered how much clarity arises when distractions fade. In that clarity, I confronted truths I once ignored, truths that shaped my decisions moving forward. Solitude gave me the space to grow into the person I needed to become. Growth that flourished without interference. As I continued shaping my story, I learned to handle challenges with more emotional resilience. Instead of reacting impulsively, I approached situations with grounded awareness. This steadiness allowed me to assess problems with clarity rather than anxiety. Over time, resilience became second nature. It reminded me that I could navigate anything as long as I remained connected to myself. That connection became my greatest resource. I noticed that becoming my own hero influenced every part of my life. My boundaries, my relationships, my ambitions, and even my habits. I became more selective with the energy I allowed around me, choosing environments that supported my growth. I aligned my actions with my values rather than my fears. This alignment made my life feel intentional rather than reactive. Intentional living strengthened my sense of purpose. Throughout this transformation, I understood that healing was not about removing the past but integrating it. My experiences, both painful and joyful, shaped my emotional depth. They allowed me to connect with myself on a profound level. This connection reminded me that my story held meaning, even in the chapters I once wished to rewrite. Embracing my past gave power to my present, power that fueled my future. Becoming the hero also required patience. Growth came in waves, some uplifting, others challenging. Instead of rushing the process, I learned to surrender to its rhythm. Surrendering didn't mean giving up. It meant trusting the unfolding of my journey. This trust softened the pressure I once placed on myself. It allowed me to evolve naturally. Natural evolution brought peace. As I stepped more confidently into my identity, I found myself letting go of relationships that held me back. It wasn't out of resentment but out of recognition. Some connections were built on earlier versions of me, versions I had outgrown. Releasing them created space for relationships aligned with my strength and authenticity. These connections supported my growth, support that felt genuine and reciprocal. Embracing the role of my own hero also meant believing I deserved a life filled with meaning. I no longer settled for half-hearted commitments, muted dreams, or watered-down versions of myself. I sought experiences that matched my emotional depth and curiosity. The more I believed in my worth, the clearer my path became. That clarity illuminated everything around me. With each decision rooted in self-awareness, my life began to reflect my true essence. I no longer needed external validation to feel secure. I no longer questioned whether I was enough. I saw my strength in the choices I made, the boundaries I set, and the transformation I embraced. This strength wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady and unshakable, steadiness that I carried into every chapter ahead. By becoming the hero of my own story, I claimed authorship over my life. I embraced responsibility, courage, and vulnerability as tools for empowerment. I recognized my potential, honored my truth, and shaped a future that reflected my deepest values. I no longer waited for someone else to guide my path. I walked forward with confidence, creating a story rooted in authenticity. And in doing so, I finally understood what true power felt like. Choosing myself wasn't the end of a story, it was the beginning of a life built on truth, strength, and freedom. Every chapter of this journey revealed how powerful it is to stand firmly in who you are, without waiting for permission or approval. Singleness didn't limit me. It expanded me. It gave me space to grow, clarity to rise, and courage to build a life that reflects my deepest values. This path taught me that independence is more than a status, it's a transformation. It's the moment you step into your own light and realize you were never incomplete. You were evolving into someone capable, grounded, and resilient beyond measure. As this story closes, your own begins. Let it be a reminder that choosing yourself is not an act of isolation, it is an act of power. And when you honor that power, you become unstoppable. This is what it means to be single by choice and powerful by nature.